The Matilda Effect is a bias towards women in science whereby their contributions and their work is either marginalised or credited to men that they worked with or, in some cases, just near. And here are some examples. But before we get to that, it might interest you to know that it's called the Matilda Effect because of this woman. Matilda Gage. She was an American suffragette and an abolitionist and a prolific writer. And one of the things she wrote was this: Woman as an Inventor in 1870. This was first pointed out in 1870. And here she lists a whole load of women all throughout history who have made major contributions to science, whose names have been all but lost, forgotten, or just pushed out of the way in favour of men. And just as a completely random aside, her son-in-law was Frank Baum, the guy who wrote The Wizard of Oz. Small world. And here are some women who have suffered from the Matilda Effect. I bet you've heard of Pythagoras, but have you ever heard of Mrs. Pythagoras? Of course you haven't. Depending on who you talk to, Theano was either Pythagoras' wife, his daughter, or maybe just one of his students. But however she knew him, she was clearly quite a big deal in her own day, and she did a lot of philosophizing and a hell of a lot of mathematical work as well. She came up with the principle of the golden mean, all of which was attributed to Pythagoras. Jeanne Barat, an 18th century French botanist and the first woman to have ever circumnavigated the globe. Now, she was the lover, the partner, and the collaborator of a botanist called Philbert Commerson, who snuck her on board the ship of one of his expeditions, and she was dressed as a man. Quite badly, by all accounts, because I don't think it really fooled anybody. But Philbert had a dodgy leg, and when they actually got to where they were going, it was like Tahiti and tropics and all that kind of place, he was really sick and he couldn't leave the ship, so she went out and gathered samples. Very, very dangerous to be doing. She went out and she gathered it and she brought it all back and catalogued it, and it all got attributed to him. Hundreds of species have been named after Commerson, and Jeanne's contribution has been completely written out. Oh, you'd be so pissed. You'd be so pissed off. Alice Ball was only 21 when she was working as a chemist in hospitals around Hawaii. And she was working on Hansen's disease, otherwise known as leprosy. And she came up with a way of being able to inject chalmugra oil into patients, which sounds hideous, but it was actually revolutionary. It was like, it changed the game completely. But she got really sick. She didn't catch Hansen's disease, it was something else. But she got sick and she had to go home. And a guy called Arthur Dean, her graduate supervisor, and the guy in charge of the lab she'd been working in, took over her work, published it all as his own, and said that it was his method. Said it was the Dean method. The fuck it is. It took years for her to be recognised, and when she was, they eventually laid down the two methods side by side, went, yeah, there's absolutely no difference here, he's clearly ripped her off. Margaret Knight was an American inventor. She actually invented loads of stuff, but in 1868 she came up with a way to make paper bags with square bottoms. We still use those to this very day. And she went to try and patent her design, but she was told that she had to come up with an iron version of the press that she was going to use. And as she was doing this, as she was working on this in her lab, a guy stole it. A guy called Charles Annan overheard what she was doing, ripped off the patent and painted it for himself. She had to file a lawsuit in 1871 to try and get the patent back to herself, and Charles's defence was that she was a woman, so she couldn't possibly have understood the technicalities of what he was trying to do. Anyway, she did get her patent back, but the cheek of it! Esther Liederberg was a microbial geneticist who played a huge part in our understanding of how genes are regulated. And she discovered a virus that infects E. coli bacteria. She would collaborate with her husband, Joshua Liederberg, and who was it who was awarded the Nobel Prize in 1958? Yeah, it was Joshua, it wasn't Esther. All of her work was attributed to him. And finally, Chen Xiongwu, a nuclear physicist. She worked on the Manhattan Project and developed a process for separating uranium. In 1956, she developed the Wu experiment, which focused on electromagnetic interactions. I can't pretend that I know what any of that means, but it was a big deal. But all of her work and all of her results was attributed to two male scientists who were working on something similar, Li and Yang. They received the credit for her work, and in 1957, they won the Nobel Prize for it. For her work. And these are just some of the victims of the Matilda Effect. God, it's infuriating, isn't it?